At 0448 hours local time, a 35-car Russian supply train, the last lifeline into Crimea, erupted into a wall of fire at the Kerch Strait. The blast came from roughly 200 miles beyond the reach of the men who launched it. Inside those cars sat more than 1 million liters of diesel and stacks of 152mm artillery shells, tens of millions of dollars in fuel and munitions bound for a peninsula that had been slowly starving for a week. When the first tank car ruptured, the fire climbed more than 200 feet into the pre-dawn sky, close enough to the Kerch Bridge that the glow reflected off the water for miles. But the explosion was not the beginning of this story. It was the end of a plan that had been waiting patiently for the right 60 seconds. That train mattered because everything else had already been cut. After days of Ukrainian strikes across Crimea, the rail line through Kerch had become the single remaining artery feeding Russian bases, radar sites, and air defense batteries in the east. Fuel, shells, spare parts, all of it now moved through one choke point the width of a bridge, and Russia knew it. The approaches to the strait were layered with some of the densest air defense on the entire front. S-400 batteries covering the sky at long range, Buck M3 filling the middle, Panzer S-1 guarding the point. On paper, the Kerch Strait was the safest place a Russian train could possibly be. So Ukraine did not attack the train first. Instead, the drones went for something that looked at a glance almost unrelated: the Kurchanskaya electrical substation a few miles up the coast. The logic was cold and precise: cripple the grid feeding the eastern peninsula, and the radar network, the command posts, and the data links stitching those air defense batteries together would stagger, not go dark, just flicker. Long enough to switch to backup power, long enough for screens to blink out and tracks to vanish for a handful of seconds at a time. Ukraine did not need 20 hours, it needed 20 minutes. And it needed the train to commit, to stop moving. At that hour, the 35 cars sat pinned at Kerch Station, boxed in by rail lines and steel and their own length, unable to scatter, unable to run. The Russian crews watching over them believed the wall of air defense around the strait made this the one stretch of track where nothing could reach them. They were exactly where Ukraine wanted them. There was only one problem. The intelligence pinpointing the gap in Russia's defenses was already a week old, and no one would know whether it still held until the first drone flew straight into it. 12 An-196 Lyutyy drones crossed into the airspace over the peninsula, and almost at once they split. The northern group pushed deep across Crimea toward the Sea of Azov, flying a little slower than it needed to, letting its signals bloom on Russian screens. It was never the main effort, it was bait, pulling radar attention and air defense firepower up onto the peninsula. The southern group did the opposite. It dropped toward the central Black Sea, hugged the water, and began working its way toward the Kerch Strait from the seaward side, threading a path meant to close like a pincer. Then everything went dark. The global positioning signal vanished. The control links dissolved into static. On the operator's screens, only wildly shifting coordinates remained behind an invisible wall of interference. This was Borysoglebsk-2, one of Russia's most modern electronic warfare systems. And on paper, it should have ended the mission right there. It sweeps the entire electromagnetic spectrum, finds the direction a transmission is coming from, then pours jamming power straight down that channel. Within seconds, it had drowned the drone's control frequencies in noise. The Russian operators watching the signal lines expected exactly what they had seen 100 times before: drones losing their link, turning back, or simply falling out of the sky. They waited for it. It never came. Here is why the system failed, and it comes down to a simple mismatch of speed. A jammer has to do three things in order: detect which frequency you are using, aim its power at that frequency, and hold it there long enough to smother the signal. Think of it like a radio host trying to shout down a heckler in a crowd. But every time the host locates the voice and turns the microphone toward it, the heckler has already moved to a different corner of the room. The An-196 never sat on one frequency long enough to be pinned. Each time Borysoglebsk-2 crushed a channel, the signal had already hopped to the next. And when the last link was finally severed, it did not matter. The onboard computer simply switched to inertial navigation and kept flying the route it had been given before takeoff, tracking its own motion through space, needing no signal from the outside world at all. Russia could silence the radio, It could not reach into the drone's memory and erase the path already written there. That was the first wall down. But silencing the jammer only got the formation moving toward the strait. It did nothing about the layered air defense still waiting there. And it did nothing about the fact that the real target, the one the whole plan turned on, had not yet appeared on anyone's screen. The strike on Kurchanskaya came first, and it came fast. A drone punched through the outer casing of the main transformer, and the shape charge warhead ruptured the cooling system. Tens of thousands of liters of insulating oil sprayed across equipment still carrying 220,000 volts. A second drone slammed into the upper section where the conductors converged, and the electricity arced across air that had just been turned to vapor. The air itself became a conductor. Arcs stretched dozens of feet across the yard, melting copper, igniting the spilled oil, and throwing a fireball more than 200 feet into the sky. In seconds, the substation lost most of its ability to move power into the eastern peninsula. That was the moment the second wall began to crack. The Buk M3. The Buk M3 is a medium-range air defense system, the middle layer that sits behind the long reach of the S-400. Its engagement radar rotates, its missiles stay ready on the launcher, and near the Kerch Strait, its crews had power the whole time. The diesel generator inside the vehicle never stopped. On paper, the strike on the substation should not have touched it at all. But a modern air defense battery does not fight alone, and that is exactly where it broke. The Buk M3 was only one node in a network. The long-range Nebo-M radar seeing dozens of miles out, the Kupol acquisition radar, the command posts, the data links tying them all together. When the grid collapsed, those pieces began switching to backup power one at a time, and every switch blinked a screen off, dropped a link, or erased a track for a few seconds. Picture a security company where every guard is healthy and armed, but someone has cut the phone lines between the front gate and the control room. The men are fine, the weapons work, they just can no longer see past their own doorway. Targets that Nebo-M once caught from far out stopped appearing consistently. The Buk M3 still had its firepower. It had lost its long-range eyes. The math of that loss was brutal. With the network intact, the crew would have had minutes to detect a threat, classify it, and fire. Now, they would not know the drones were coming until they crossed their own radar horizons, which meant seconds, not minutes, and at nearly 150 miles per hour, a drone eats a lot of ground in a few seconds. The southern group used exactly that blindness to slip through. 2 missiles did leave a launcher, and 2 An-196 died in bright fireballs over the rail line when the radar held its track just long enough. But then another power switch broke the link. The last 2 missiles lost their guidance, and the drones dropped behind the freight cars and vanished. And this is where the plan nearly came apart. Because there was one system the Blackout should have crippled and didn't. As the surviving drones broke through toward Kerch Station, two S-38 Derivatsiya-PVO guns opened fire out of the dark. The Derivatsiya doesn't need the network. It hunts with passive electro-optical and thermal sensors. It stares and listens rather than pinging, so it emits nothing and it never went blind when the data links died. Its thermal cameras found 7 hot shapes moving through the rain and locked on. In a matter of seconds, 57mm rounds tore 4 drones out of the sky. The one weapon that was supposed to be neutralized by the Blackout had just become the thing most likely to end the entire mission. And Ukraine had only 3 drones left. 3 drones left. 2 57mm guns still firing, and a train sitting a half-mile away. The lead, An-196, pulled its nose up hard. It climbed into the cold sky, deliberately making itself the brightest thing on both thermal screens. Both Derivatsiya turrets swung onto it. The barrels elevated. Streams of 57mm fire reached up after the climbing drone, and the crews poured everything into the one target they could see. That was the trade Ukraine wanted. While the guns pointed at the sky, the last 2 drones dropped to ground level and split. One curled west around a row of freight cars. The other hugged the storage yards to the east. The Derivatsiya's sensors still knew roughly where they were, but knowing is not firing. Each gun could aim along only one line at a time. To catch the two drones slipping behind them, the turrets would have to abandon the climber, rotate almost fully around, and build a new firing solution from scratch. At less than half a mile, there was no time to do that. The decoy kept climbing into the fragmentation bursts, holding every barrel pointed up, and underneath it the final two Lyutyy slipped past the flanks and turned their noses toward the train. Their thermal cameras showed 35 cars stretched across the rail lines. Fuel, shells, weapons, the Lifeline pinned and waiting. Two drones, two warheads, one had to hit fuel, one had to hit ammunition. Miss with either and the fire could be contained. Land both and nothing on that train could stop what came next. The first dropped to 50 feet and raced down the tracks. It locked onto a tank car, 75,000 liters of diesel, and struck. The warhead tore the tank car open. The blast wave split the welds, and diesel poured out across the rails in a black flood. It did not detonate the way it does in films. Diesel is stubborn, slow to catch, but red-hot steel fragments and sparks from the shredded electrical lines found it, and the fuel became a river of fire running the length of the train. 6 seconds later, the second drone hit the ammunition car. The warhead bent the steel walls inward and drove thousands of fragments into stacked 152mm shells and their propellant charges. For a heartbeat, nothing. The first blast stayed trapped inside the car, a deep, muffled thud. It almost looked like a failure, then the car came apart. The roof blew off, fragments ripped into the neighboring cars, and the river of fire already running beneath the train reached up to meet them. The shells began cooking off one after another, driving the chain reaction outward in both directions along the line. Cars ruptured, couplings snapped. In under a minute, the column of fire had climbed hundreds of feet, the rails buckling beneath a load they could no longer carry. The 35-car train was no longer going anywhere. When the fire finally settled, the accounting was simple and devastating. 35 cars immobilized. More than 1 million liters of diesel burned off into the sky. Stacks of 152mm shells gone, not captured, not recovered, detonated in place. The rails themselves warped under the heat, couplings snapped, cars torn from one another, and scattered along the line. This was not a train that could be repaired and sent on its way in a day. The line through Kerch Station itself would have to be cleared, rebuilt, and reopened before anything moved through it again. But the deeper damage was never really about the fuel or the shells. It was about the choke point. Russia had funneled the survival of its eastern Crimea forces through a single artery precisely because the Kerch Strait was supposed to be untouchable, the most heavily defended stretch of sky on the front. Ukraine did not defeat that defense by overpowering it. It defeated it by pulling one thread, a substation a few miles up the coast, and letting the whole network stagger just long enough. And so the strike forces Russia into choices it cannot afford. Shut the rail line down to repair it. Pull air defense assets off the front to guard the rear. Assume from now on that every train moving toward Crimea is a target the moment it slows down. That is the real cost. Not one train, but the certainty that no train is safe. Because Ukraine does not need to destroy every convoy that rolls toward the peninsula. It only needs to prove once that even the best defended lifeline can be severed at its narrowest point, and let that doubt travel down every mile of track that follows. A supply line only works if the men depending on it believe it will arrive. After Kerch, that belief is the thing that burned hottest. In your view, which move decided this entire operation? The blackout at the substation, the decoy that pulled the guns skyward, or the patience to wait until the train had nowhere left to run? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you want more breakdowns like this one, subscribe and follow along as we keep tracing the drone war strike by strike.